Thank you. I'll kick off with an obvious observation that'll color the theme of my talk tonight, which is that it's not 1980 anymore. Okay. It's like Dorothy might have said to Toto in The Wizard of Oz, okay? We're not in 1980. And I'll tell you, today I think we face two existential threats to our country that are different from anything we've faced in our nation's history. The first is the rise of a Chinese Communist Party that, unlike the Soviet Union in 1980, supplies the phones in our pocket and the shoes on our feet. It's different this time around. The second thing that's different from 1980 is that the biggest threat to liberty and prosperity today is not just big government, but a new hybrid of big government and big business that together is more powerful than either one alone. Now, we face these threats against the backdrop of a national identity crisis. And here I speak as a member of my generation. I'm a millennial. I'm 37 years old. I was born in 1985. And I will tell you that my generation and younger, we are hungry for a cause. We are hungry for meaning. We are hungry for purpose at a time in our national history when the things that used to fill that void of purpose, things like faith, patriotism, hard work, family, these things have disappeared in modern American life, leaving a deep moral and cultural vacuum in its wake. And when you have a black hole that runs that deep, that is when poison fills the void. That is why we flock from one secular religion to another, from wokeism to climatism to COVIDism to transgenderism or transgender authoritarianism, as I think the word that Skip was using, and I was chatting with him beforehand. Why do we do it? Why do we suffer from this mental health epidemic, depression, anxiety raging in my generation and younger? I think it is in part because we hunger to be part of something bigger than ourselves, yet we cannot even answer the question of what it means to be an American in the year 2023. So that'll be the theme of my talk this evening. What does it mean to be an American today? As I begin to answer that, I'll take you back to a moment in 1993. When I was in second grade, and I heard Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech for the first time. That was the speech where he said, I hope my 4 children grow up in a country where they are judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. I'll tell you something, that dream, it stuck with me. It meant something to me because it was the dream that allowed me to go in a single generation from being the kid of Indian immigrants who came to this country with almost no money to becoming the founder of a multi-billion-dollar biotech company. I had the privilege of leading that company as CEO for 7 years, oversaw the development of tens of medicines, 5 of them are FDA-approved products today. But I stepped down as CEO of that company over 2 years ago to focus on a different kind of cancer. Not a biological cancer, but a cultural cancer that threatened to kill that dream that Martin Luther King had 60 years ago. That threatened to kill the dream that allowed me to achieve everything I ever had in my life. One of the things they teach you in biotech and in medicine is that in order to understand a cancer, you have to go to its root causes. The root causes of this cancer began not in even 21st century America, but actually in the 20th century on the other side of the ocean. The root cause of this cancer was you take the 2 most toxic philosophies of the 20th century. Ask me what they are. German Nazism on one hand, which is identity politics on steroids, and then Soviet Marxism on the other, which is an oppressor-oppressed narrative on steroids. You combine the two, and what do you get? You get modern wokeism here on 21st century American soil. This is a new secular religion in our country. It says your identity is based on your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation, full stop. It says that America is a systemically racist country, that if you're black, you're inherently disadvantaged, that if you're white, you're inherently privileged. No matter your economic background or upbringing, actually, It is your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation that govern who you are, what you're allowed to achieve, and even what you're allowed to think. This is a new form of psychological slavery, actually, today. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, I quoted her earlier today in a breakfast meeting I was at. I'll give her a full quote, actually, tonight. She famously said a couple of years ago that we don't want any more black faces that don't want to be a black voice, that we don't want any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice, end quote. I promise you, I do not fit her description of what counts as a brown voice. But there is a toxic philosophy embedded in there, and it's this. When your race goes from being about your skin color to being about the content of the ideas you're allowed to espouse, then any disagreement with those ideas automatically makes you a racist. And there is no greater damnation in modern America than to be called a racist. So when given the choice between pledging allegiance to this new religion and being tarred with that scarlet R, everyday Americans are choosing to bend the knee. And that is what's created this new culture of fear in our country. Fear of losing your jobs, fear of your kids getting a bad grade in school, fear of becoming a pariah in your own community. And that culture of fear is what's replaced our culture of free speech in America. And as I said in that video, the best measure of the health of any democracy, especially American democracy, is the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually think in public. And there is no doubt we are doing poorly today. The question is, how do we get here? It actually starts in an unexpected place. Part of it actually starts with an economic movement that began in this country in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. I had a front row seat to the 2008 crisis, okay? Got my first job at a hedge fund in New York City in the fall of 2007. It's an interesting time to join the workforce. And that's the thing about us millennials, too. You can understand where this hunger for purpose comes from. You grew up in an era that had you have a jaded view of capitalism. And why is our view of capitalism so jaded? I'm speaking on behalf of my generation. It's because actually the Republicans in this country made a mistake on the back of the 2008 crisis. Okay, the way it's supposed to work is we have creative destruction, what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction, in the cycle of how capitalism recreates itself and rises from the ashes. We didn't let that happen after the 2008 financial crisis because the Bush administration and Hank Paulson, who was most recently the CEO of Goldman Sachs, who was then the U.S. squatting as the U.S. Treasury Secretary, decided that we were going to bail out the banks whose behaviors got us into the 2008 financial crisis. They bailed out the banks at the public fisc. They used public money to bail out bankers who made a lot of money when times were good to get bailed out when times went bad. This was a mistake made by Republicans in this country. And so, if you ask me, understandably, there was an uprising and a revolt. It's called the Occupy Wall Street movement that said that, well, if that's what you're going to do, it's going to be crony capitalism all the way down. If it's just a game and a sham anyway, then you know what we're going to say? We're going to storm Wall Street. We're going to say that we're going to take money from those wealthy corporate fat cats, redistribute it to poor people to help poor people, because if that's the way you're going to play the game, then this is how we're going to play the game, and that's how it's going to be. But then something else happened right around the same time, which was the birth of a new strand of the left with the election of Barack Obama as the first black president of the United States in 2008. There was the birth of a new strand of the left around that same time that had a slightly different theory of the case. And what they said was, well, hold on a second, Occupy Wall Street, okay? It's not just economic injustice. It's not just poverty that we care about. We have some new concerns on the left, like racism and misogyny and bigotry and, of course, climate change. You know what? This turned out to be the opportunity of a lifetime for big business in this country. Because if you're big business, if you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street is a pretty tough pill to swallow. But the new woke stuff was actually pretty easy. You applaud diversity and inclusion. You put some token minorities on your boards. You muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly in a private jet to Davos. It's pretty good work if you can get it. But they did not do it for free. They expected that new left to look the other way when it came to leaving their corporate power intact and it worked masterfully like a charm for both sides. That is the story of how a bunch of big banks got in bed with a bunch of woke millennials who themselves are hungry for a cause. Together they birthed woke capitalism, and they used that to put Occupy Wall Street, the old left, up for adoption. And it worked so well on Wall Street that Silicon Valley then said, okay, we're going to get in on that. Because, you know what, if you're Silicon Valley back in 2010, 2009, the threat to your power used to come from the left. Break up big tech was not a right-wing slogan back then. It was a left-wing slogan back then. They were skeptical of the monopoly power of the rise of concentrated behemoths in Silicon Valley. So you know what Silicon Valley said? They said, okay, we can make that same deal with you. We will censor hate speech and misinformation as you define it. We will use our power to advance your substantive ends. But again, we will not do it for free. We effectively expect the new left to look the other way when it comes to leaving our monopoly power intact. And again, that trade worked masterfully for both sides. That is the story of this unholy alliance, this arranged marriage. It was not a marriage of love. It was an act of mutual prostitution, and the net result of that act was the birth of a new Leviathan, far more powerful than what Thomas Hobbes envisioned 400 years ago, far more powerful than what our founding fathers envisioned 250 years ago, this new woke industrial, ESG industrial complex that's a hybrid of government power and corporate power that together could accomplish what neither could on its own. And then that's how you get the litany of what you saw follow in the years thereafter. The rest of corporate America gets in on the act. Coca-Cola making statements about a new voting law in Georgia that make it sound more like a super PAC than a soft drink manufacturer, teaching its employees how to be less white. Their words, not mine. While they do nothing about, by the way, their own impact on a nationwide epidemic of diabetes and obesity in the black community that they profess to care so much about, or Nike that decries slavery 250 years ago in the United States without saying a peep about using slave labor in places like China today to get $250 sneakers that they sell to black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. This is the whole litany. Okay, it just keeps going on and on. This is the game they played. Now it gets a little worse. The story takes a dark turn when you have that much concentrated power, right? The American vision was about distributed power through our democratic body politic, distributed power through free market capitalism. But when both the capitalism and democracy get in the same bed, you have concentrated power. What does that do? It lends itself to capture. And that is when a third party showed up on the scene and realized they could turn this bilateral arranged marriage into a three-party affair. That is the Communist Party of China. And what China realized was that this is an opportunity. If we can get those same companies that relentlessly criticize alleged social injustices here in the United States to come do business in China without saying a peep about the actual human rights atrocities over here, if we can get them to obsess over climate change and foist emissions caps on American energy companies while also investing in PetroChina without demanding the same thing over here, great. We have undermined America's greatest geopolitical asset of all. And that is not our nuclear arsenal. It is our moral standing on the global stage. If you have any doubt about it, just listen to what Xi Jinping says on a given day. Okay? Every time he's been pressed on the Uyghur human rights crisis in Xinjiang, where there are over 1 million Uyghurs enslaved in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilization, communist indoctrination, and worse, in probably what is the worst human rights atrocity committed by a major nation in the last century, the first thing he says is that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. This is not an accident. The first time their top diplomat, Yang Jiechi, came to talk face-to-face to Tony Blinken at the Alaska summit, his 15-minute opening statement was all about how China wanted to see the U.S. do better on human rights and that China wanted to stop seeing the U.S. stop slaughtering, as his word, slaughtering black Americans. This would be laughable if it weren't for the fact that our own corporations lend implicit credibility to those claims. When Disney says it cannot shoot a film in the state of Georgia if Georgia passes an anti-abortion statute, or that it cannot abide a new law in Florida that says that you can't teach six-year-olds or 7-year-olds about gender identity and transgenderism, when they then go to Xinjiang to shoot Mulan in literally ground zero of that human rights crisis, that actually creates a false moral equivalence between the United States and China, between Chinese nihilism and American idealism. And in fact, Disney went one step further. Not only did they not say a peep in China, they included at the very end of the film a kowtow to the Chinese Communist Party saying that, we thank you for allowing us the privilege of filming here. They're thanking the local CCP authorities, the very authorities who were responsible for perpetrating that human rights atrocity. Okay. So you might ask yourself why these companies do it, and the answer is actually really simple. Of course, it comes down to money. You all know this. Now, why is that? It's because if you're entering the Chinese market, okay, China builds a great Chinese wall that stops you from selling products in China if you criticize the CCP. But if you criticize the United States, they will roll out the red carpet. So companies do what companies do, whatever allows them to make the most money. But that is why Tim Cook, Larry Fink, John Donahoe at Nike, they are Xi Jinping's circus monkeys. He will say jump. They will ask how high, because in the end, it comes down to their own bottom line. Now, this is not something that I put at the feet of one political party or another. Okay? This is the product of a bipartisan consensus in this country dating back 30 years in America. Okay? The bipartisan consensus, what they called it back in the 1990s, was the philosophy of democratic capitalism. Okay? What did the philosophy of democratic capitalism say? It says that we can use democracy, we can use capitalism as a vehicle to spread democracy to places like China. We had this fantasy, okay? Thomas Friedman, world is flat, end of history. That we can export Big Macs and Happy Meals, and somehow that was going to spread democracy to places like China. Well, what they realized is that they could turn that game on its head. We thought we could use our money, our investment, to get them to be more like us. What they realized is that they could use their money, access to their money, their market, to get us to be more like them. Or even one step better than that for them, that they could use our money to get us to be more like them. And they sent back those Disney movies and Nike sneakers and Apple iPhones like Trojan horses to undermine the United States from within. So I could go on and on about the problem. But I think that it is time that once we're able to see the problem with clear eyes, we begin to find our way towards solutions. What do we actually do about it? Thank you. First thing I will say is that not all solutions, despite the fact that we're in the Institute of Politics, I will say, not all solutions come through politics. The market can offer promising solutions too. The three most powerful financial institutions in the United States are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Three institutions that just the three of them manage over $20 trillion on a given day. That is more capital in three hands than the entire U.S. GDP. It is the largest concentration of private capital in private hands in human history, but they're using the money of everyday citizens, I would venture to say of many, if not most people in this room, directly or indirectly, to tell American companies to adopt one-sided political agendas, from racial equity audits to emissions caps, that most everyday Americans, most of you in this room, do not agree with, and which do not advance your best financial interests. That is a fiduciary breach. It is the largest scale fiduciary breach of the 21st century, but rather than just observe it, that creates a market opportunity. That is why I personally founded Strive a little over a year ago, a new asset manager that is competing directly against the likes of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, using the money of everyday citizens, thank you, to tell American companies to do something really simple. Focus on your products and services, and yes, making money doing it without apologizing for it, without mingling your business in any other social or political agenda, because that's what American excellence is all about. That's what capitalism is all about. Now, you ask yourself why BlackRock actually behaves this way. It gets really interesting. The same company, the same asset manager that is telling companies like Exxon and Chevron to drop oil production here in the United States to meet net zero targets by 2050, is actually seeing some of those same projects still proceed. They still just proceed under new ownership. I wonder how that helps global climate change. Last time I checked, turns out PetroChina is buying up projects that firms like Chevron are dropping. So you might think, if you're a climate activist, that you'd be happy if BlackRock is actually causing Chevron to drop an oil project. Well, what you didn't realize is that PetroChina's just buying up that same project in the Sichuan province of China to be able to do the exact same thing. But then you look up who's one of the largest shareholders of PetroChina. It's actually none other than BlackRock, using Chinese money on the other side for Chinese clients to own those shares. That's why I said, you know what, at Strive, we didn't want to bear these conflicts of interest. I said, we're not doing business in China. We can't build an asset management business in China and have the boot of the CCP on our neck if you're going to claim to be a good vocal fiduciary for Americans. But this is an example of where the market actually can create new opportunities to compete with many of those existing incumbents to serve probably 100+ million Americans in this country who are not only badly disaffected from the places where they bank and where they shop and where they invest, but who happen to be some of the best customers that any business could wish for. And so I believe deep in my bones there is an opportunity to drive positive change through the market without touching the sphere of politics. But I don't believe that market solutions alone can power the national revival that we actually need in this country. Our inner animal spirit at the heart of the American soul, it has been domesticated, it has been tamed by this new culture that rejects truth and embraces relativism, that rejects equal opportunity and embraces equal results, that rejects excellence and embraces victimhood. That inner animal has leapt oceans to lift up places like China, while their culture of Maoist victimhood has leapt back in the other direction to hold us down. And you know what I say? When we rallied behind the cry, many of us did, to make America great again, we did not just hunger for any single man. We hungered for the unapologetic pursuit of excellence in this country, because that is what it means to be American. Thank you. I think this is an opportunity for the conservative movement, for the GOP in this country, to create a new American dream for the 21st century that revitalizes the ideals that set this nation into motion almost 250 years ago from places not far from where we're getting together here, right here in New Hampshire. I think it is an opportunity to revive basic ideas, the basic rules of the road, ideas like merit, the idea that you get ahead in this country, that you get into this country based on merit. I'll talk about getting ahead in this country. Let's even just talk about who gets in, okay? My parents came to this country in the late 70s in my dad's case, in the early 80s in my mom's case, through the front door, legally. They followed the rules. They worked hard. They paid their taxes. They made sacrifices. They raised 2 kids in this country who each went on to found companies that went on to employ and help thousands of Americans. Okay? They taught us that hardship isn't the same thing as victimhood, that there is more to life than self-indulgence, that getting married, that creating a family does involve some level of sacrifice, but some sacrifices are worth making for something greater. We should want more immigrants in this country like my parents, but we have to embrace them by also acknowledging, and I say this as a first-generation American, that we cannot open our arms to a wave of immigrants whose first act of entering this country is a law-breaking one, because we are a nation of laws. That is part of what it means to be American. It's not just merit about who gets into this country. After you get in, it's about meritocracy in who gets ahead in this country. Embracing the idea that Martin Luther King was right. I think the GOP can be not only the party of Lincoln, but the party of MLK, reviving our conviction in the idea that you get ahead in this country, not on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character and your contributions. What does that mean? Thank you. It means that we start by getting rid of racial discrimination in every form and every way in this country, and that includes when the Supreme Court overturns affirmative action in college admissions later this year, as I expect they will, that we take that movement to every sphere of American life. I tell you, the next president of the United States, I'll teach you something tonight that even I didn't know a year ago, until I started writing, thick of writing books about this stuff and teaching it for my own self. I was ashamed I didn't know. Most of the spread of affirmative action in this country, like most bad things, I think, lay at the feet of the federal government, actually, in the United States. Executive Order 11246, Johnson-era executive order that says if you want to do business with the federal government, that you have to adopt race-based quota systems in your hiring practices. That encompasses from Google to Boeing to General Motors, companies that encompass over 20% of the U.S. workforce is hired against the backdrop of racial quota systems created by none other than the U.S. federal government itself. From Ronald Reagan to George Bush to Donald Trump, Republican presidents have had an opportunity to draw a line through that, but they said they weren't going to do it for fear of political backlash. I think we need a Republican president that, without fear, will say that we are the party of Martin Luther King, we will not tolerate federally mandated racial discrimination, and eliminate that executive order once and for all. This is not that hard. It's low-hanging fruit, it's easy, and it's the beginning of eliminating de facto racism in every other sphere of our lives. Not just anti-white racism or anti-Asian racism, which is where it begins, but a new wave of anti-black racism in this country like I haven't seen in my lifetime. Growing up as a kid in Southwest Ohio in the 1990s, the reason is there's no better way to fuel racism in this country than to take something away from someone else on the basis of the color of their skin. And so whether it's worried about anti-white racism, anti-black racism, or anything in between, we need to revive that pursuit of excellence over de facto racism in America through that idea of putting merit back into America itself. Yeah. Thank you. I think we need to restore merit in government. I have a very clear view on what this means. It's a dream I have as a citizen, that the people who we elect to run the government are the people who actually run the government. That is not the case today. Okay, we have a federal bureaucracy that grows like a national cancer, metastasizing from one sphere of life to another, to an alphabet soup that grows to more letters than we have in the alphabet, from the FTC to the SEC to the DOJ to the FAA, now delegating its dirty work to a new alphabet soup of AMZN, MSFT, FBGOOG. It is a government industrial complex that actually runs the show today. You know what I say is that if you're the President of the United States, elected by the people of this country, and you cannot serve for more than 8 years, I don't think most federal bureaucrats should be working for the federal government for more than 8 years either. Thank you. We need to take those civil service protections. I've run companies, okay? I'll tell you this. If you tell me one of my employees works for me, but that I can't fire them, you know what that means? That means they don't work for me. It means I work for them. It means I am their slave, because you have to take responsibility for what they do without having any influence over what actually happens. It is a myth, and yet that's the position the President of the United States is in today. Republican, Democrat, it does not matter. It is an illusion. It is a hollowed-out husk of a constitutional democracy that we go through all the motions of casting the ballots if the guy we put in charge to run it, whether it's in the federal government, whether it's even at the state level, isn't even the person who's running the show. I've actually seen this in my travel of the states. I've been, in the last 12 months, 12 to 18 months, I'd say, been to a majority of U.S. states in this country. Part of what I've been doing, is part of my day job for the last year at Strive, is meeting with state pension systems. Okay, you want to talk about the deep state exists in the federal government, the deep state exists within the states too. I'll have a conversation with them. I'll say, okay, well, here's what your governor said, here's what your attorney general said, here's what the public elected officials of your state believe about how your dollars ought to be invested out of your pension fund system. What's your perspective on this? They say, we don't work for them. I say, well, who exactly do you work for? I never get a straight answer. Get a blank stare in the face. They view the publicly elected officials as some sort of nuisance, as some sort of inconvenience. Okay, the Democratic ones view them as a problematic inconvenience. The ones who self-identify as Republican view them as cute little puppets. But there's actually the real people running the show is this managerial class that pervades the public sector, the private sector alike. The same people who are the undersecretary of God knows what in the federal government, then come to the private sector to sit on a corporate board of director or be a vice president at some pharmaceutical company somewhere in the middle of a managerial bureaucracy in the private sector, to be the associate dean of God knows what at some university, pushing a DEI agenda, and then getting some ambassadorship sitting in Austria. Okay, that is the managerial class that runs the show today in every sphere of our lives. And if we're going to dismantle the managerial class, it has to start with the federal government itself. And there's just a lot we can do as a conservative movement. Okay, there's a trick they play on you. The trick they play on you is that the more boring it sounds, the more it's supposed to put you to sleep so you're not paying attention. So I'm going to tell you one that probably would have put you to sleep if you weren't awake to the reality that I'm telling you about. Think about this. Raise your hands in this room. I just want to see it. Okay. How many of you have heard of impoundment prevention? Do those words mean anything to any of you? Not seeing a lot of hands up. Okay, I've seen one hand up. Thank you. JD, love it. Thank you. You're my hero. So this guy knows he knows where I'm coming from on this. So impoundment prevention. Okay, what does this say? It says that, let's say you're going to have a lot of presidential candidates waltzing through here, okay? They're going to think they're running for the highest office in the land. What are they running for? They're running for a hollowed-out husk of a White House that they get to live in without realizing that they're just a puppet because there's a new one coming along in 4 years. Because you know what? If you're the president, you think you run the executive branch of the government. Not only can you not fire the people who work for you, you also actually have to, let's say there's an administrative agency that's spending money, and I don't want them to be spending that money, okay? Department of Education, God knows why this even exists, by the way, at the federal level. That's a discussion for another day. But let's say, okay, first thing I want to do is I want to fire half the people. Can't do that. Okay, now I want to shut you down. Well, there's some other civil service protection law that says you can't do that. So, okay, at least I want to slash your budget in half. Can I do that? Nope. Can't really do that either. Why? Because we have a law passed under the Carter administration that says that there's an anti-impoundment protection that says that if Congress budgets the money, you have to actually spend it. You have no choice but to spend it, and not only spend it somewhere, but to spend it in exactly the same administrative agency that was the source of that waste, fraud, and abuse. So, you know what I say is, you might have a generation of Republicans, the Mitt Romneys and the Paul Ryans of the world, who, even back in their, when they were actually, real figures, might have said something like, we're going to save some money by doing this. And I agree with that. I want to eliminate these kinds of managerial overspending sprees because it could save money, which means lower taxes and we stimulate the economy and all that stuff. I'm on board with it. But I think our real reason is not just because we care about the dollar savings. It's because we care about the integrity of a self-governing democratic body politic, a constitutional democracy, a constitutional republic. That's why we actually care about this. Waste, fraud, and abuse is bad, but the real rule of the road is the thing we set into motion in 1776. The idea that whoever we might elect and put in that office, it's the people who we elect as citizens that we want running the government, that we, the people, put into power to run the government, rather than a self-appointed aristocracy, which is the real party that runs the show today. That is what merit in government looks like to me. Now, we can only ever achieve merit in these spheres of our lives and who gets into the country, who gets ahead in the country, who runs the government, if we also allow meritocracy to thrive and to rule in the marketplace of ideas. The fact that we're even able to have this conversation at an institute like this one is no longer something we can take for granted in this country. The best ideas win when no ideas are censored. Okay, you want to censor the wrong ideas, keep doing that. You know what you're going to find out? Some of those wrong ideas you censored turned out to be the right ones in the end. Just ask Galileo. Just ask half the doctors who were talking about the COVID-19 pandemic over the course of the last 3 years. Thank you. But it is not just a precondition for truth. I think we live in a moment in America today where free speech is a precondition for peace. If you tell people they cannot speak, that is when they scream. If you tell people they cannot scream, that is when they tear things down. Okay? Free speech isn't what got us January 6th. Free speech might have been one of our ways of preventing it from ever happening again. Now, I don't rail about big tech censorship anymore. I call it what it really is. Government tech censorship. Because what's really happening today, to call out the essence of the real problem, is the government is using private companies to do through the back door what government could not get done directly through the front door under the Constitution. Thank you. They're using threats to private companies to take down disfavored political speech. They give you carrots, like Section 230C2 protection that gives you a federal blanket of immunity if you go down and left a nice little attaboy on the back for what the government wanted you to do instead. Anyway, White House officials calling officials from Twitter in, telling them specifically to take down by name, I'm not making this up now, by name individuals like Alex Behrens and others who are critics of the government. If there's one thing that makes George Washington roll over in his grave, it is the idea that the federal government would silence a critic of that government. If there's one thing the First Amendment was supposed to do, it was supposed to be one that allowed our citizens to criticize their own government. And yet, not only is it happening, it's happening in a manner that was designed for us not to see, because they're using the so-called invisible hand of the market, right? The fetishes that we developed 40 years ago, the slogans we memorized in 1980, back against us to be able to do what government could not otherwise do. You know what I say? If it is state action in disguise, then the Constitution still applies, and actually these companies ought to be bound by the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States if they're working hand in glove with the federal government to do its dirty work. Thank you. Now, it's not just a free speech problem on the internet. Okay, the free speech problem pervades the private sector as well. It strangles American workers. The number of workers who were fired in the last 2 years for saying the wrong thing on social media, for wearing the hat of the wrong political candidate, for saying the wrong thing even on their own time, going to the wrong political rally, it is staggering. It is unacceptable in this country. And you know what I say? I say that if you cannot fire somebody or deplatform somebody on account of their race, their sex, their sexual orientation, their religion, their national origin, then you should not be able to fire somebody or deplatform somebody on account of their political beliefs either. We need to make political expression a civil right in this country. Now, I agree with you. Amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If we're the party of MLK, let's take that vision. Do it in the states and do it in the federal government. Now, I had a discussion. I had a discussion with you. Tell me your name again last night. Nick. Free Stater, right? Yeah. All right. So Nick and I had a little debate last night. Okay. The debate it was fun. We had some fun debate. It got a little heated, but that's okay. We had a fun debate. We need more of that in this country. We had a little debate last night. He says, "Okay, look, I'm a libertarian, and I don't want one more constraint on what private businesses can and can't do. The government should not be interfering in this, and the market should figure this stuff out, okay? Because if there are these silly businesses over here that are firing all these conservatives, that's an opportunity for these other businesses over here to hire them instead. This is free market stuff. Okay, good. I used to be a libertarian too. I get it, and it makes sense. There's a lot of logic to that argument. But here's the problem: we cannot have it both ways. Either we actually trust the free market and we get rid of those protected classes altogether, or we apply the standards even-handedly. Say, if you can't fire somebody or deplatform somebody because they're black or gay or Muslim or white or Christian or Jewish or Hindu or whatever, that you should not be able to fire somebody or deplatform somebody just because they're an outspoken conservative, liberal, or libertarian either. America is not a country that forces you to choose between speaking your mind freely and putting food on the dinner table, between the American dream and the First Amendment. We are the quintessential nation on earth that allows you to enjoy both of those things at the same time. That, too, is part of what it means to be American. Thank you. I say, what can we do? If we can do these things, if we can revive the answer to the question of what it means to be American, revive merit in who gets into this country, revive excellence in who gets ahead in this country, revive meritocracy through free speech and the ideas that get ahead in this country, rediscover the ideals that set this nation into motion, then, and only then, can we then rise to the occasion to face down the number one existential threat that we will face over the next decade ahead. And it is coming. It is already looking in the sky. You'll already see it here on a given day. It is the rise of communist China. We are in a codependent relationship with the CCP. Codependent relationships do not end well. The only question is who ends it first. The sooner we end it, the better for us. The later we end it, the better for them. And we have an opportunity to declare independence from China. I think that is the declaration of independence of 2024, when we declare independence from communist China. But Mark, thank you, but it's not going to be all that rosy, because it will involve some measure of sacrifice. Because we put ourselves in this position that we relied on them for the chips that power the phones in our pocket, the laptops that put this on the screen, probably the refrigerator that kept that water bottle cold before you're drinking it. How we got here to rely on one small island off the southeast coast of China in the South China Sea to power our entire modern way of life, I don't know. That's a shame for how we got here. I do know, but it's a longer story. But the point is, it's going to involve some level of sacrifice. Okay? It's going to involve some level of sacrifice for our kids to tell them that if you can't smoke an addictive cigarette by the age of 18, then you should not be using an addictive social media product like TikTok before the age of 16 either, maybe not even at all in this country. That's going to involve some sacrifice. To tell businesses in this country that you will not, and I want to say this out loud really precisely, because the Republican Party is under the control of a donor class that's not going to like me for saying this very much. I know this because a lot of them are my peers in the business world, okay? You cannot do business in China until the CCP reforms its behaviors, including intellectual property theft, including American user data theft, and other forms of state interference. That is a condition for any American business doing business in China until the CCP reforms its behaviors. That will involve sacrifice. To deliver accountability for the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, using every financial tool in our arsenal to do it, including but not limited to looking at Chinese holdings of American debt. Again, that will take some measure of sacrifice. But I will tell you, giving up on this global climate religion, by the way, the same climate religion that shackles the U.S. economy without laying a finger on China. For the believers in this religion, that will involve some measure of sacrifice. But we can muster the power to make these sacrifices if we know what we are making the sacrifice for. And if we can answer that question of what it means to be an American, then I think we can rise to that occasion, the occasion that America beckons for. Not Chamberlain, but Churchill. That is our moment today. And I will tell you, we have spent the last decade in this country celebrating our diversity and our differences, while we forgot all the ways that we are really just the same as one people bound by a common set of ideals that set this nation into motion 250 years ago. Thank you. E pluribus unum. From many, one. That is the vision that won us the American Revolution. That is the vision that reunited us after the Civil War. That is the vision that won us 2 world wars and the Cold War. That is the vision that still gives hope to the free world. And if we can revive that common vision over fractious group identity, then nobody in the world, not a nation, not a corporation, not a virus is going to defeat us. That is what American exceptionalism is all about, and that is what we're going to need to revive in order to save this great nation. Thank you. God bless you all. I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. sit down.
Yeah, tell me where to sit. Thank
You
you.
can sit on the
This side?
probably on this side. I think you get a better view.
Thank you.